1 year ago to the day, I was on a little belated 5th year anniversary weekend trip with Alyssa to beautiful Palm Springs, California. Has anybody here ever been to Palm Springs, California? While we were there, we ate dinner at a restaurant that used to be Cary Grant's house. That might be more cool to you than it was to me. Somebody kind of had to explain that one to me. One thing they didn't have to explain, we went on a tour of one of Elvis Presley's houses while we were there in Palm Springs. It had a 28-foot sofa. It also had a king-sized circle-shaped bed, thick shag carpet in the bathroom, and a really odd tour guide who may or may not, but definitely was, living in that house after tour hours were over. It was one of the strangest half-hour tours I've ever been on. And on that day in Palm Springs, 1 year ago, October 7th, 2019, the high temperature in Palm Springs was 106 degrees, which in Palm Springs they call sweater weather. And really, by the time it was nightfall, it kind of was. It got down to like 60 or even 55 degrees in the evening. But even in October, can you imagine that, Texas friends? It was 106 degrees on October the 7th, 2019. And if we had been there 2 months before that, in August, they had a day where the high temperature was over 120 degrees, because Palm Springs is in the desert. And that is perfectly okay with me so long as I get to have a big, tall milkshake and sit around in the air conditioning. But that little adventure that weekend with Alyssa gave me a whole lot more sympathy for the Israelites that we're going to be talking about in our story from Scripture tonight. We are getting into Israel's story and also continuing in the series we began last week on the life of Moses as he leads God's people into the unknown. We're picking up that story in Exodus chapter 15. If you'd like to get out a Bible and be turning there. And when we get to Exodus chapter 15, the part that we're going to be looking at tonight, we are just 3 days in to Israel's first days of freedom from the Egyptians. Just 3 days removed from that immensely triumphant scene when God parted the Red Seas and they passed through and they watched their enemies wash away and they were free. Just 3 days in to this journey full of unknowns. And in the first 3 days that Israel is in the desert, they have no water to drink. And so begins the first of 3 consecutive stories in the book of Exodus, where the people of Israel are searching for the things they need in a great unknown. On the surface, these are stories about water and food. But I think if you dig just a little bit deeper than the surface, we find that it's not water and food that God's people really need. That's what they think that they need. But the question for tonight is, what does God think that they need? What does God need for Israel to find in this wilderness? Well, let's look at the first of these 3 stories in Exodus, and you see what you can see here. Exodus chapter 15. We're going to pick up in verse 22. There we read that Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the Desert of Shur. So there they go from that moment of freedom, and straight from there, they're right there in the desert. And for 3 days, they traveled in the desert without finding water. Until finally, they come to this place called Marah. And good news, there's water there, but they could not drink it. Do you know why? Yeah, I heard somebody say it. And also, fans of the book of Esther, you might know the answer to this too. Remember how Naomi in the book of Esther, this is Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, after her father has passed away, or her husband has passed away, and after her 2 sons have died in the war, she gets back to Bethlehem, and she says, "Call me Naomi no longer. Call me Marah," which is the Hebrew word that means bitter. Call me bitter. Well, here are the Israelites. They've been journeying in the wilderness for 3 days with no water, and finally they find water, but bad news, it's in a place called Marah. And lo and behold, when they try to drink that water, they could not drink it. That's how bitter it must have been. And the text even tells us that's why they called the place Marah, because the water was so bitter there. So we got a problem here, don't we? 3 days in the wilderness. I don't know how hot it was. My time in the desert says that would not be very pleasant. No water to drink. Big problem. Where are we going to find water? Because even the water that they find, they cannot drink. So what do the people do? What would you do? Here's what the people do. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" They grumbled against Moses. Hold on to that thought. So we started with a problem. Where are we going to find water? We've seen Israel's response. They grumble all about it. And I got to tell you, before I get on my high horse, I've got to say, I've grumbled over a lot less than that. 3 days in the desert with no water. But nevertheless, that's their response. They're grumbling at Moses. What about Moses? What's he going to do? All these people. Is he going to do any better? Actually, quite a lot. Moses cried out to the Lord. And that's when we find the most important response of all. What God's going to do. What will God do for Moses and his people in this moment? It starts like this. Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and suddenly the water became sweeter. Suddenly the water became fit to drink. In other words, God takes this water that is of no good, useless to them, and he turns it into something good. What God does here, actually, is a reverse plague. That's what he does here. He takes something bad to good in the same way that just a few chapters earlier, he took something good and turned it bad in Egypt. So you remember how in Egypt, God used Moses to perform those 10 plagues in order to free his people from Egypt. What was the first of those plagues? What's the first one that he did? He turned the waters of the Nile into blood. And how did he do it? This part, maybe we don't remember as much. They took the staff, Moses and Aaron, raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh, and they struck the water of the Nile. And when the wood of that staff struck the water of the Nile, suddenly that good river turned to something gross, turned to blood. But now, God takes the same thing and he turns something bitter, and it is Marah no more. Now it's something good. Now it's something sweet. God does sort of a backwards plague here, which, we call a blessing. God's response is provision. He provides for what they need. Now put yourself in the shoes of those people at this moment. they've got to be thinking right now, we've found the thing we needed most. But God's not quite done yet. God says, you found the thing you were looking for. Now let me show you what I am looking for in you. What you should be looking for is not water. What you should be looking for is trust. This is not a story about finding water. This is a story about finding trust. Which raises the question for me, can that be done? Can Israel actually find a deeper trust in God now that they are in the wilderness? Can we actually deepen our trust in God when we face unknowns? Or will we find that trust, like water in the desert, is scarce and hard to come by when we're facing the great unknown? Will we find that when we actually dare enough to trust, it leaves a bitter taste in our mouth, like that water that they first found in the desert? How can you trust in a wilderness? Can this story teach us how? Personally, I think the story says, yes, you can trust. Actually, it says, yes, you must trust, even in the wilderness. But if you're going to find trust, it matters where and how you seek it. And you know one great way not to find trust is to always be looking for something to grumble about. That's one great way not to find trust, is if our eyes are always looking for something to complain about. Now, to be fair, if you are in a desert, literally or figuratively, you're not going to have to look very hard to find things to grumble about. But is that really the best way to find trust? To find trust in the midst of an unknown, it matters where and how you seek it. And this story says it's not grumbling. It's listening and remembering. That's how you find trust in the great unknown. So God says, I've given you what you were looking for. Now let me show you what I am looking for in you. And in verse 26, he says to them, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commandments and keep all of his decrees, things are going to go well for you even in this place and time. And those things that you saw happen to the Egyptians, I will not bring on you any of those diseases that, remember, I brought on the Egyptians. I'm not going to give you plagues. I'll give you reverse plagues. I'll give you blessings. Because I am the Lord who heals you. So what is it that God wants them to find in this desert? He wants them to find more than just water for today. He wants them to find the kind of trust in him that will satisfy them and sustain them every day. And the way to do that is to listen and to remember. Remember who I am. Listen carefully to what I say. For I am the God who heals you. And then, of course, to top it off and to prove what I've just shown you, God says, I'm going to give you something more. God has already provided for his people, but I'm going to go beyond that. When you learn to listen and remember me, I'll take you to Palm Springs. I'll show you the abundance of my care for you. Verse 27, then they came to Elim, which I'm calling the Exodus version of Palm Springs. Because there they found 12 springs, one for each tribe in the whole group, and 70 palm trees. And they camped there near the water. Actually, they camped there for almost a month and a half, which totally dwarfs that 3 days of intense struggle. Their present sufferings in that moment were not going to compare to this rest that God had in store for them soon in the Exodus version of Palm Springs. And that's the kind of God they're invited to trust right there. To trust the kind of God who does more than just meet their needs, but who actually gives them exceedingly more. The kind of God who redeems the temporary and those struggles in the unknown with something more lasting. A lasting rest. And Israel gets a little glimpse of that here. We do too. Because we, like them, are invited to trust in the Lord, even when we face great unknowns. And you know, the great thing about the next 2 chapters of Exodus is that if you understand that story we just looked at right there, you know what's going to happen for the next 2 chapters of the book of Exodus. They're really just a piece of cake because they're one and the same kind of story. It's like almost exactly the same story told over and over again. Really, maybe the tragedy is that it needs to be told over and over again. But if you listen closely to that one, you know what's coming next. So if you go to the next chapter, Exodus chapter 16, when that chapter comes, it starts just like 15 did with a problem. This time it's not water. The problem is food. Where to find food. And how do you think the people are going to respond? Well, if they have listened carefully, and if they are remembering, they might say, remember Marah? Remember what God did for us there? Or remember the Red Sea, how God took care of us there? Remember when he took us to Palm Springs and gave us rest there? God's got this taken care of. But that's not how they respond. Instead, they do the same thing over again. In fact, they do it louder this time. They turn up the volume and grumble, verse 2, against Moses and Aaron. And actually, this time, they're not just saying, where's the water? This time, what they're saying is, what have you done, Moses? What have you done bringing us here? Verse 3, if only we had died by the Lord's hands in Egypt, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve the entire community to death. It's all your fault, Moses. They're grumbling again. And as they do, they're showing us one more way not to find trust in the wilderness. First, we saw that the way to not find trust is to always be looking for something to grumble about. Now we see another surefire way not to find trust is to always be looking for somebody to blame. And for the Israelites, that is very often Moses and his brother Aaron. For us, it could be others, politicians, teachers, school boards, parents, teenagers, millennials, baby boomers, people we share a pew with, leaders who meet or don't meet our expectations, people of different races or classes or worldviews. When we're in the pressure of an unknown, it's not hard to want to look for somebody else to cast the blame on. And you know, sometimes our opinions or our criticisms might even be justified. It's really not what I'm talking about tonight, though. The question I'm asking tonight is if we're always constantly looking for somebody to blame, is that going to distract us from the real looking looking for trust, looking for deeper trust in God. If we're always looking for somebody to blame, it might actually take our minds off of listening carefully and remembering those things that really help us to find trust. And I think that Moses, as a leader, starts to see this, because when they start to blame him for things, he says, look, you can blame me all day, but your attention is misplaced. Verse 8, he says to the people, you really ought to be thinking about God here. Do you trust God? Who are we? We're just the people he asked to lead you. You're not really grumbling against us, Moses says. You're grumbling against the Lord. I think all Moses is doing here is trying to turn their focus back onto God, the God who heals them. And the best thing is, God is so gracious. God is so patient and forgiving that he just repeats the cycle over again. Just like he did in the first story. Despite the grumbling of the people, he comes through again. He provides. This time it's manna from heaven. This time it's quail for dinner. He works another miracle of provision. He says, here's what you were looking for. I'll meet your need. But then, just like before, he reminds them, don't forget what I am looking for too. It's not food. I'm looking for your trust. I want your trust. So, he has a few things to say about listening and remembering. Verse 16, God gives them some instructions and says, when I give you this bread from heaven, only collect the part that you need. Not more, not less. Just what you need. And when the Sabbath comes, you rest. You can collect extra the day before, but when the Sabbath comes, just rest. He's giving them these instructions. He says, listen to my words. And everybody who actually listens to his words, they have everything they need. But the ones who don't listen to his words and they go and do their own thing, the bread in their hands just turns gross. It's all out of date all of a sudden. God's trying to teach them. Listen carefully. And then he says to Moses, get a jar. Get a jar and put some manna in it. Now, why would he do that? To be kept for the generations to come. He wants them to remember this. Remember this, so you have a reason to trust in me. God is teaching his people to listen and remember because he really wants them to find trust in the unknown. And then, of course, he adds the cherry on top, just like he did before. He's not just going to give them bread for the day. No. He'll give them so much more. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they finally found their way to where they were going. That's like 14,000 plus days that God provides this daily miracle that even to get it once would be just like truly remarkable. But year after year after year, he keeps giving them just what he needs. It's almost like he's saying, day after day after day, I'm the one you can trust. I am here. So listen. So remember. I'm the God who is with you. And by the time we get to chapter 17, there's really not much left to say. This stuff happens one more time. This time it's not food, it's back to water again. The people need their water. And they grumble again. It gets worse than before, if you can imagine. Moses says, they're ready to stone me. This time they even turn against God. They say, "Is the Lord among us or not?" But what does God do? He just keeps providing. Just keeps giving them reasons to listen. Just keeps giving them reasons to remember and trust. And he helps them to find what they need when they seek it. So this time God takes a rock. Not just any rock, actually. A rock at Horeb, which is another name for Sinai, Mount Sinai. So here are the people. They're saying aloud, "Is God really with us or not?" And little do they know that they are close enough to the rock of Mount Sinai that God can pour out water from it for them. And not long from this moment, God is going to descend on this very mountain in this cloud of his terrifying, awesome, fearful, but you definitely notice it, presence on this very mountain. And there will be no question about whether God is with them there or not. No question at all. Soon they will know, right at this very place. But what God is teaching him is that they don't have to wait until then to start trusting him. They can trust him in the midst of the unknown. And we can too. God doesn't want us to wait either. Soon we will see. God has promised that when Christ returns, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. We'll all see and know. But we are invited to trust him now. There's a reason that 2 Corinthians says that we walk by faith and not by sight. Because like Israel, we may face many unknowns and many troubles along the way, seasons that challenge us, problems in our lives that really test us. But trust can be found in those places too. It matters where and how you look for it. I can say for myself, sometimes I look for reasons to grumble and reasons to blame other people more than I should. And I would do a lot better at trusting God if I would start listening a little more deeply and reminding myself a little more often the kind of God who's with us. And maybe that's something you need in your life tonight as well. The questions I would leave you with today are you listening? Are you listening carefully for God's voice? Are you listening and following God's word with your actions? Are you remembering? Are you remembering what he did for people like those children in the wilderness? They faced great unknowns. He was with them all the way. Remember that. Are we remembering all those times God has been with you in your life? Are we remembering how God can take the temporary and show us how much greater is the eternal? Are we remembering what Christ has done for you and me? Who knows? But maybe in the unknowns that we face right now, it might lead to something good, like deeper trust in God, springs of trust welling up in our hearts, and palm trees to rest in the shade of the knowledge of the God who is with us every day and who blesses us beyond all imagination. Maybe you need to hear this tonight. Maybe you can respond in your life by listening and remembering. Maybe someone here tonight needs to respond to the saving power of God, which is on full display in Exodus. He parted the waters that Israel might go through. And when we pass through the waters of baptism, we're raised up in him, raised up to follow him, and even in the unknown, to place our trust in him. However you may be called or challenged tonight, we offer this moment to respond while we stand, while we sing.